Howdy partners, it's your favorite cowpoke of comedy here, ready to take you on a wild ride through the wacky world of the Wild West. I've been rustling up some of the most bizarre tales from the frontier, and boy, have I got a treat for you today. Picture this, the sun's beating down on the dusty streets, tumbleweeds are blowing through town, and the only sound you hear is the creaking of leather and the jingle of spurs. But not everything was as it seemed in these here parts. The Old West was full of surprises, and some of them were downright hilarious, or should I say, deadly. In today's video, we'll be counting down the top 5 most unusual demises to ever grace the pages of Western history. These ain't your typical shootouts or saloon brawls, no sir. We're talking about the kind of endings that'll make you scratch your head and wonder how in tarnation did that happen. So grab your hat, saddle up, and get ready for a Wild West whimsy that'll have you chuckling and gaspin all at the same time. Trust me, you ain't never heard stories like these before. Let's get this wagon train moving and dive right into the top 5 unusual demises of the Wild West. Did you know they used to call the Wild West the Wild Yeast because everyone was rising to the occasion or getting baked in the desert sun? Just kidding. But speaking of the Wild West, now there's a term that conjures up images of dust-covered cowboys, saloon brawls, and high noon showdowns. But what was the Wild West really like? This era, spanning the late 19th century, was a time of rapid expansion and frontier life in the western United States. It was a time when lawlessness was the norm and survival was a daily struggle. With the harsh living conditions and the looming threat of danger, life in the Wild West was far from a romantic cowboy movie. It was more like a dance with death. So, saddle up and get ready for a wild ride as we explore the 5 most common causes of death in the Wild West. Now you might think the number 1 cause of death was getting shot in a saloon over a poker game, but you'd be dead wrong. In fact, the real Grim Reaper of the Wild West was something far less cinematic, but infinitely more sinister: disease. Yes, friends, back in the day, the most common cause of death was not a bullet from a 6-shooter, but the invisible bullets of bacteria and viruses. You see, medical knowledge in the Wild West was about as scarce as a rain cloud in the Mojave. The local doctor, if there was one, was as likely to bleed you with leeches as he was to give you a shot of whiskey and send you on your way. And the concept of sanitary conditions. Well, let's just say that folks were more familiar with the business end of a horse than they were with a bar of soap. Imagine a world where a simple cut could lead to a deadly infection, where drinking water could be a gamble with your life. In the Wild West, the silent killers were diseases like cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis. Cholera, for instance, struck fear into the hearts of pioneers. This nasty little bug could take a healthy person and, within a matter of hours, leave them as lifeless as tumbleweed. And let's not forget about the infamous consumption, or tuberculosis as we know it today. This lung disease had a knack for turning strapping young cowboys into wheezing shadows of their former selves. And the cure? Well, there wasn't one. Not for a long while, anyway. Now compare that to our world today. We have antibiotics, vaccines, and an understanding of how diseases spread. We have clean water at the turn of a tap and soap in abundance. So, the next time you complain about a flu shot, just remember, it could be cholera. Surprisingly, getting shot in a duel wasn't as common as Hollywood would have you believe. The Wild West was not just a place of high noon showdowns and gunslinging outlaws, but also a land of unpredictable perils and hazards. You might be thinking, where are the quick draw contests and bullet-ridden saloon brawls? Well, they existed, but they weren't the norm. The second most common cause of death in the Wild West was, drumroll please, accidents. Yes, you heard it right, accidents. The Wild West was a dangerous place, and it wasn't the gunslingers you had to worry about most of the time. It was the everyday hazards that were the real killers. Imagine this. You're out in the wilderness, tending to your cattle or mining for gold. You're not looking out for outlaws or Indians, you're too busy trying not to get trampled by your own horses or avoiding rock slides in the mines. Life in the Wild West was fraught with dangers that had nothing to do with the romanticized duels we see on screen. Mining accidents were particularly common, with cave-ins, gas explosions, and even flooding posing significant risks to miners. And let's not forget about the dangers of working with livestock. Horses, cattle, and even chickens could pose deadly threats if not handled properly. And then there were the environmental hazards. Flash floods, lightning strikes, and even cactus pricks could spell the end for an unlucky cowboy. The Wild West was not for the faint-hearted. Every day brought with it new challenges, new risks, and new potential accidents. The Wild West was a place of adventure, of discovery, and yes, of danger. But it wasn't the danger of a quick-draw showdown that most people had to worry about. It was the danger of the everyday, the danger of the mundane turned deadly. So, remember, always tie your horse securely. You never know when it might cause a stampede. You'd think with all those wild animals around, people would be dropping like flies, but the real danger was a little closer to home. Now let's giddy up and dive into the third and fourth most common causes of death in the Wild West: animal attacks and murders. Now, I know what you're picturing. A cowboy, alone on the prairie, suddenly locked in a life-or-death struggle with a grizzly bear. It's a thrilling image, isn't it? But the reality? Well, it was more likely to be a cowpoke getting a nasty nip from a rattlesnake or the occasional kick from a mule. Yes, friends, the Wild West was less man versus beast and more man versus slightly irritable farm animal. But let's move on to the wilder men. The Wild West was notorious for its lawlessness, and murder was certainly a part of that. But here's the kicker. The number of people meeting their end at the hands of another was, well, shockingly low. If we were to believe every Hollywood Western, every other building in the Wild West should have been a graveyard. Yet, the reality was that your average saloon was more likely to serve up a round of poker than a round of bullets. So why this discrepancy? Well, it turns out that folks back then were just like us. They preferred a quiet life. Sure, there were outlaws and gunfighters, but they were the exception, not the rule. Most folks were more interested in building a life than taking one. But don't get me wrong, the Wild West was still a dangerous place. Between the wildlife and the wild men, there were plenty of ways to meet an untimely end. But it seems that the biggest danger wasn't the grizzly bear lurking in the woods or the gunslinger at the bar. It was the everyday hazards of life on the frontier. So it turns out, the Wild West was more like a wild petting zoo. If the petting zoo was full of homicidal maniacs. Now, the biggest killer in the Wild West wasn't a gunslinger, a bear, or a deadly disease. It was something far more terrifying: the weather. That's right, folks, the weather. Now, I know what you're thinking. Weather? Really, Christoph? I was expecting something a bit more dangerous. Well, let me tell you, in the Wild West, the weather was the most dangerous outlaw of them all. Imagine battling soaring temperatures in the desert, with the sun beating down relentlessly, turning cowboys into human-sized jerky. Or freezing winters that could chill a man to the bone faster than a shot of whiskey. These extreme conditions were a daily reality for folks in the Wild West. And let's not forget the storms. Oh, those storms. Dust storms that could strip a man bare, and not in the fun way. Thunderstorms that seemed to shake the very earth beneath your boots. And the tornadoes, those twisting, twirling dancers of destruction. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the weather was its unpredictability. One moment, you're basking in the sunshine. The next, you're caught in a flash flood. The weather was a fickle mistress, changing her mind faster than a gambler changes his luck. And yet, despite all this, people survived. They adapted. They built homes that could withstand the worst of it. They learned to predict the weather, to prepare for it. They showed a resilience and determination that is truly admirable. So why is it that when we think of the Wild West, we think of gunslingers and outlaws rather than the real killer? The weather? Maybe it's because the weather doesn't make for a good villain. It doesn't have a face, it doesn't have a motive, it just is. But let's not forget the real heroes of the Wild West, those who braved the elements and survived to tell the tale. So, the next time you're complaining about the heat, just remember, at least you're not in the Wild West. So, there you have it. The Wild West wasn't quite as wild as we thought. Sure, there were the occasional duels at high noon, but more often than not, it was just a case of low noon show-ups. And yes, there were wild beasts and even wilder men, but when it came down to it, the real showdown was between man and nature. We've also debunked the myth of dying from a thirst for knowledge. It was more like dying from actual thirst. So, before you saddle up and ride off into the sunset, remember that the Wild West was less gunsmoke and more Little House on the Prairie. And let's not forget the biggest revelation. The most common cause of death wasn't a bullet from a six-shooter, but more mundane things like disease and accidents. Remember, folks, the Wild West may have been wild, but it was also just West. Stay safe out there. Well, my friends, that brings us to the end of our wild and wacky journey through the most unusual demises of the Wild West. I hope you had as much fun watching as I did telling these tales. It just goes to show that truth is often stranger than fiction, especially when it comes to the frontier. Before you ride off into the sunset, I want to take a moment to thank all of you for saddling up and joining me on this adventure. Your support means the world to me, and I couldn't do this without you. If you enjoyed this video and got a kick out of these bizarre stories, I'd be mighty grateful if you could hit that like button and leave a comment down below. Let me know which unusual demise tickled your funny bone the most. And if you're new to these here parts, consider subscribing to my channel. It'd help me out more than a cold sarsaparilla on a hot day. Until next time, keep your boots clean, your hat on straight, and always watch out for those pesky tumbleweeds. You never know what kind of trouble they might lead you into. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time for another Wild West Whimsy.